You're listening to IceBreakers, the podcast exploring all things Canadian and Eurasian, business, culture, and personalities. The series is produced by CERBA, the Canada-Eurasia-Russia Business Association. We're a non-profit supporting trade, investment, and good relations between Canada and the countries of Eurasia. I'm your host, Nathan Hunt, one of the founders of CERBA and former chairman of the National Board. I invite you to tune in regularly for valuable insights relating to the region. Hello, everybody. I'm joined today by Margaret Skok, career federal public servant who's worked with the RCMP, Fisheries and Oceans, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Canadian Heritage and Industry Canada. She served with Global Affairs Canada at the embassy in Moscow from 1991 to 94, and as the ambassador to the Republic of Kazakhstan from 2009 to 2014, with concurrent accreditation to the Kyrgyz Republic and the Republic of Tajikistan. She worked with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to develop an international nuclear strategy and has participated as an accredited Canadian observer to elections in Belarus and Ukraine, a thankless task, I'm sure. She is currently senior fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and we are very pleased to have you with us today. Margaret, hello.
Good morning and good evening. Thank you so much.
And I should say Merry Christmas. It's almost Christmas, isn't it, where you are?
Well, both, impending Gregorian calendar Christmas, 24th, 25th, then New Year, and then Julian calendar Christmas, January 6th and 7th. So happy forthcoming holidays to everyone.
And dare I add Julian calendar New Year's to that list? Yeah, we have lots of holidays in Russia.
January 13th, so I guess we won't see you until the 14th.
That's right, the old New Year, as they say. Your mother's last name was Karolkevich before she married your father?
Karolkevich.
Sorry, mispronounced that. Was she of Polish descent? What's your background?
Both my parents were born in Poland just before World War II. And after the war, they were declared stateless, ended up in resettlement camps. They were called displaced persons in Germany, from where they emigrated to Canada in 1949, my father first, to Saskatchewan on a farm contract, of course. My mother followed 6 months later. What was really historically interesting was they both came over on the Queen Elizabeth. They landed in Halifax, Pier 1, and their names are on the passenger list at the Pier 1 Museum in Halifax.
Is that right?
Yep, they ended up in settling in Winnipeg, which is where I was born, and there it begins.
Well, lovely, lovely. Now, you began your federal career with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Were you a Mountie on a horse? Were you in an office? What were you doing for the RCMP?
I was in an office, no horse for me. I began my career in the federal public service as a summer student with the RCMP. In something called a single fingerprint section. So I couldn't tell your horse apart from the other horses, but I can pretty well tell your fingers apart from somebody else. Then I went on to work for the then Secretary of State in Ottawa, and I moved to Montreal, where I worked with employment and immigration centers for students. Then I worked for the Citizenship Court for Pierre Laporte's widow, Madame Juge Laporte. And then I worked on employment projects in the northern part of Quebec, Lac-Saint-Jean.
You have a diverse portfolio.
Yeah, I learned how to race Trans Ams.
There you have it. Now, you did join Ag Canada's international team in 1987.
Yeah, I went on to work at Natural Resources Canada when I moved back to Ottawa, Fisheries and Oceans, and Agriculture Canada.
So was it... in 1987, was it hard to get an international assignment as a woman at the time, or was that not a difficult thing?
You know, I have to credit two people. I was sitting very comfortably at Agriculture Canada in the Trade and Trade Policy desk when the late Right Honourable Don Mazankowski decided, in response to a call from our ambassador in Moscow, that I would be the one who would come to Moscow to assist with some of our line of credit issues and trade issues. And Subsequently, after the late Right Honourable Don Mazankowski, it was the Honourable Charlie Mayer, who's still in Winnipeg, who was the wheat board minister and then became the agriculture minister, who kept me there for a long time to continue to resolve issues.
You say kept you there. Do you mean in Moscow?
Yes.
How long were you in Moscow? What years?
From February 91 to late 94.
That was an exciting time to be living in Moscow, and I think you even had a few young kids in tow, did you not?
I have two of my own children, plus I had guardianship for a 15-year-old. So I went with 3 children.
Wow. And a single mother. That must have been a challenge.
I didn't talk about that much.
Did you have daycare? You must have had daycare then.
Well, you couldn't then in 1991, but the 15-year-old would greet the children from school, and quite often they would be at the embassy after they were dropped off. I must credit most recently deceased, our ambassador, Michael Bell. He died two weeks ago. He and his wife, Christine, were most amazing support to myself and the children. Without them, it would have been very difficult. And my colleagues in both the political and trade sections were superb.
I mean, it must have been difficult just to live in Moscow in those days. The stores were empty. How did you even get around or buy food?
I fought in the local markets, making sure that I took limited products so as not to take cabbage and carrots and fresh produce away from locals. There was one Western store at the time which carried sundries, Peter Eustason. And thanks to 12 years of work in Moscow region with our livestock, our seed potato, our McCain fry technology, George Cohen's Moscow McDonald's opened up. So it was an amazing effort. As I said, 12 years before the first store on Pushkin Square opened up.
So what were you doing during the 3.5 years that you were in Moscow? Were you involved in McDonald's? Were you involved in sale of Canadian produce to Russia?
I was certainly involved in our trade, which went from grain to agriculture, food to livestock to genetics. One of the important things that I was dealing with was the ever-changing, at customs point, phyto and zoosanitary certificates. And once again, I have to thank the former Minister of Agriculture, the former Finance Minister, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, late night calls from me because of calls from our Canadian companies to say that their products had been held up at customs. And within 2-3 hours, I would get a call back to say our products had cleared. A lot of these products were short shelf life, such as the lobsters for Friday nights at the former Aerostar Hotel, which used to be joint between Aeroflot and an IMP company in Halifax. Leaf cutter bees, nobody's heard of those, but they were pollinators for alfalfa, which was required as feed. And so these certificates had to be confirmed very quickly, and this product had to leave very quickly, so there was no, so we didn't lose the product. And then Chisholm, which represented all of our pork sales from Canada, we were able, over time, it took 6, 7, 8 months to work with the Ministry of Agriculture to get the zoosanitary conditions that we needed in order to do our first shipments of pork to Russia.
Canadian pork, and that ended up being most, I would say, not most, that's not right, 1/3 of Canada's total exports to Russia for many years in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. You paved the way for that. You were there when the very first Canadian pork arrived, weren't you?
I actually was at the airport at 2:00 in the morning.
Well, there you have it.
Importantly, because I was dealing with agriculture, I was also dealing with the Ministry of Finance on debt servicing. The largest debt that the former Soviet Union had to Canada was its line of credit to the Canadian Wheat Board for grain shipments. And we were able to confirm that this was a sovereign debt. As a result of being confirmed as a sovereign debt, we actually began to get payments on our line of credit. So that took a year and a half. But so that was extremely important. Because I worked in agriculture, as quickly as collectivization happened during Stalin's time, decollectivization happened under IFI, different loan banks. And that was critical because it affected particularly remote areas, collective and state farms, which overnight changed. And as you know, these collective and state farms is not a farm or an enterprise, it's a whole village. And so there was a lot of disruption and exaggerated disparities in society and the economy. And by 1993, there was a nostalgia for the former Soviet Union. I was therefore fortunate as a result of dealing with agriculture that I was in every single part of of Russia and the former Soviet states, so the newly independent states.
I'll tell you, having a little experience in agriculture myself, I can remember bringing American and Canadian farmers over to meet with their Russian counterparts and hearing the conversation go something like this. On our farm, we have a swimming pool. Do you? On our farm, we have a post office. On our farm, we have a hospital and daycare. And it became very quickly evident that the term farm meant one thing in Russia and an entirely different thing in the West. Yeah. So what you said about the farm being a community is very true. We and that was one of the reasons why agriculture was so inefficient. It's all these municipal services are important, but it's hard to recover the costs if you have to recover them only through the sale of what you produce on the farm, because you're not going to cover the cost of a swimming pool and a clinic and a movie theater just by selling wheat.
The rural development at that point was not elevated, and it was cut off from the urban centers. The other thing, the disruption on the farms also allowed for not great practices. And I felt awfully sorry for farmers who spent forever in state offices getting permits, paying taxes. And again, those things just changed all the time until a little bit more discipline was brought in. The first 2 years after the coup in 91, and I remember being on the bridge, and I remember Moscow McDonald's sending in trucks of food for the poor soldiers who had not eaten for 3 days.
This was during the first coup in 1991.
August 91.
Oh, wow.
I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30, and I heard what I thought was thunder. The sun was rising. I couldn't see any clouds. I looked down, and the tanks were approaching the White House. And I called our Canadian embassy to say, listen, you might want to get in touch with the Americans, because the American embassy was right behind the White House. Anyway, it was after 3 days. I mean, a new regime was put in place. That also made it difficult for our, not just agriculture, but all of our delegations that were coming over, because the negotiations on agreements were protracted, because the first 6 months, ministers changed almost every week. So whom you were going to meet with was not whom you signed the deal with.
I remember those days, Margaret, and I remember in 1989 and 90 signing something with the federal government, and then finding out in 1992 that there is no federal government anymore. It's all RSFSR, or the Russian government, or the Ukrainian government, or the Kazakh government. That we were dealing with suddenly 15 newly independent states rather than the old Soviet Union that we had.
Right. Because of agriculture, my exposure to the regions was early, and it was very comprehensive. For example, my visits to nuclear fueling stations in Murmansk, and then also looking at issues of trade potential, being in Siberia, ports, of course, and then also in Yakutia. An interesting non-agriculture and non-trade fact was looking at the wooden houses in Yakutsk and seeing one that resembled a smaller model of Chateau Montebello outside in Quebec, where we've had G7 meetings. And it was interesting, even though the architects for the Chateau Montebello were Finnish, etc., one of the original carpenters was from Yakutsk. So there were lots of people connections. They talk about that. It actually happened.
Oh, good Lord. And we recently had an episode with Yakut native Valery Maximov, who, as you know, serves as Russia's trade representative to Canada right now. And he talked about Canadian companies building homes in Yakutia. But anyway, getting back to your time in Russia, I want to talk about Central Asia, but let's finish Russia first. You also served as an observer for elections, and I guess that wasn't in Russia; that was in Ukraine and Belarus. What was that like? You told me during our last talk, you told me some interesting stories.
So that happened. My observation, OSCE ODIHR observation missions happened after I retired. And for example, I was in Maidan Square in 2013. I was in Minsk. How is that? Those transformations were more difficult in those countries than in some of the other countries. The elections were more disrupted. The young people were protesting. It was very difficult. And there was a lot more violence.
Wow.
And the objective of the OSCE ODIHR Office of Democratic Institutions observations is to determine whether it's parliamentary or presidential elections, whether they're fair, right, and just. And it was difficult to determine if they were fair and just. And one of the major stumbling blocks sometimes was actually getting the ballots to the electoral commissions in the capitals.
And why was that a stumbling block? They didn't have adequate transportation?
Depending on the cars were carrying the ballots in sealed envelopes. It was a question of where those ballots were coming from and the anticipation of non-support for the established government or president.
I think you're hinting that you saw irregularities.
And I think the reports would say that there were irregularities. But this was also, I put it in context. This is also new. Elections were new. And multi-party options were unheard of. So this was also new. It's not unexpected that there would be huge difficulties. And so one of the objectives of the OSCE is not just to monitor, but also to help ensure that the processes are compliant, right? So it takes some time.
Let's move to Central Asia. You were ambassador of Canada to Kazakhstan and accredited to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan at the same time from 2009 to when? Was it 2014?
It was 2006 to 2009.
Oh, good Lord. I have my dates wrong. Sorry about that. Okay, at 2009, then that would have been the time when we dedicated the new Canadian embassy, was it not?
Yes. So my mission terminated with the declaration of our embassy, a new embassy in the new capital.
In the new capital of Astana.
Yes. At the time it was Astana. And the Honourable Stockwell Day was there. And once again, we were fortunate to have, I'm not sure, Canada had amazing access to the Prime Minister at the time, Masimov, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and the different departments, natural resources, industry, trade negotiators. And we also had a great access to mayors of remote, both mining and rural areas. And it was really important because it was fascinating to learn of the junction of multitude of cultures, religions, different geopolitical interests in the region, and the different levels of economic and social stability. I have always said that leading up to legislative and regulatory and policy reforms, for example, in Kazakhstan, the impetus was to create less disparity, more of a middle class. But there were two, I often talk about it, there were two, for me, important developments which led the way. One was macroeconomic reform, and that was establishing a banking and a financial sector, critical. And the other was former President Nazarbayev's Bolshak Scholarship Program. There are, as of today, 100,000 Kazakh students that have studied abroad. So they bring back skills, knowledge, and new thinkers to the new capital. Originally, they got jobs in the public sector, and then as the private sector emerged, they also get jobs in the private sector.
So that's been a very effective program, you think?
I think it's effective in terms of mobilizing change.
Now, the country has had outstanding economic growth since achieving independence in 1991. Of course, it was slow to start with, but the growth was much better in the 2000s. Do you think that they have that they'll be able to reach their goal of being one of the world's top 30 most developed countries by the year 2050?
The short answer is yes, but there are three things that mitigate against quick rise. Is number one, right now would be COVID-19, which has disrupted economic systems. Number two, it will be the support for additional reforms during this really difficult time. And number three, they have amazing investment laws, legal laws on paper, and it will be the continued ability and capacity to enforce those laws.
Are they difficult to enforce now? Do you think they're not being enforced to the full extent?
You would probably be aware of this as much as I am. It is a question of the breadth and scope of reforms in 30 years has been massive. Is there the capacity to enforce?
Interesting. Well, you've told us a lot about Kazakhstan. What do you think about Kyrgyzstan? Did you ever get to, you must have been in Bishkek on more than one occasion?
On many occasions, almost weekly, because of our gold operations, CERBA, and also because of our cooperation with His Highness the Aga Khan's University of Central Asia. On the gold negotiations, both former presidents that I had the pleasure of dealing with were the critical points of contact on behalf of our company, CERBA. With respect of the University of Central Asia, as you know, the campuses are now in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and they provide ability for students and teachers. So there are a lot of teachers from Canada, and the head of the University of Central Asia is Canadian, and that means the education there, particularly in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, is in place. And they often call them mountain universities because normally these young people would not be able to leave home to study abroad, unlike in Kazakhstan. So this education was extremely important.
So you segued very nicely from gold to education. Education, I think, has a happier story to it. But tell us a little about the gold dispute. It's still in dispute, isn't it? Do you think the Kyrgyz government was fair with Canada, at least at the beginning, and things got worse, or where are we there?
I think there have been iterative legal agreements and contracts. I think the question is always ownership and also royalties and a desire for more controlling shares. They can avail themselves of any law firm in the world that they want. At the beginning, the issues were very much dealing with local law firms and understanding investment, the level of investment and the level of royalties. I remember one of the IFIs present at one of the discussions said, "We will be watching how CERBA works out, as that will be an example for us as to whether or not the Kyrgyz government follows international practices."
And so far, the jury's still out, I think.
Yeah. I mean, everybody wants a piece of the action.
Nothing new there. Well, we don't need to get into the detail there. I'm sure we'll let the lawyers do that. Tell us about Tajikistan. I've never been to Dushanbe. You must have been there a time or two or three. What are your impressions of that country?
These countries are signatories to the Ottawa Convention, and so it's the anti-personnel landmine. So we had a lot of work with them on this, and then the removal of them. And then we also had a lot of work with them in terms of aid to local farms, particularly women working in farms and ancillary businesses like bakeries. Most of the women were left alone in Tajikistan because of many of the men being migrant workers abroad. And that would mean mostly Russia at the time that I was there. And so these women were left with children and with farms or inability to make some money. So a lot of our aid, as well as international aid, went towards farms and agriculture. The other partner there on business was, again, the University of Central Asia and His Highness the Aga Khan. There were hotels there that were often empty, but they provided space for local businesses. And I remember saying to His Highness once, I said, support programs in Canada have a ceiling. At one point they have a threshold. At one point they end. They don't, 3 years, 5 years, 2 years. And I remember His Highness looking at me and saying, well, do you see things getting better quickly? And I go, not really. And he goes, that's how long we're here for. And I think that long-term view is what was critical, and it certainly was instructive for me. And watching the US and EU build the bridges for markets to Afghanistan, being in the south in Horog, where the products flowed 2 ways, that was critical as well.
So I've got to ask you, you repeated several times, His Highness. I'm going to show my ignorance. Who are we talking about? What king are we talking about here?
His Highness the Aga Khan.
That's the proper term to refer to him.
Yes.
Interesting.
Or you could drop that preface and talk about the University of Central Asia. But in addition to the University of Central Asia, His Highness the Aga Khan was also involved in the development of entrepreneurship and hotels. And even though they stood empty, the point was it was work for local people.
And you talked a little bit about your work promoting women in trade and promoting women's rights. As I recall, you received the Senate Award for Women in International Business. Was that because of your work in promoting the role of women in business, or was it simply a recognition of your own accomplishments?
I was working with women in international business. I also did a lot of submissions to the hearings of Senate committees. I talked to them about some of the modernization of the laws, such as the introduction of the legalization of abortion under 23 weeks. I also talked to them about the fact that the 2 leading women on trade policy negotiations, on WTO accessions, on trade in general, were women in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, who ultimately became deputy ministers and ultimately got postings as ambassadors. At one point in the Senate in Kazakhstan, there was a parity, just like there was a gender parity in Canada. And it was important to see that these reforms didn't just go to traditional business, but it also went to the position of women as entrepreneurs in these societies, critical, again, because of migrant workers.
Good for you for supporting women. I never thought about that, but you're right. We see migrant Tajiks and Uzbeks all over Russia, all over Moscow, really. And that must mean that there are women back home managing the home fires.
And a lot of the returns don't often get back from their husbands from wherever they are for a number of reasons. And so they do need to rely on the local economy for jobs and revenue.
Now, you were with us, I think, during the one of the initial sessions, maybe the initial session of the Kazakhstan-Canada Business Council, which was a joint venture put forward by CERBA and the Kazakhstan Chamber of Commerce in the beginning. What did you think about the KCBC initiative? What did you think about the sessions, the working groups? Was that useful? And what do you remember from the sessions that took place while you were the ambassador?
Well, first of all, I thought the work was concrete. That was what was really important. The thing is that, and the people who came to the table were prepared. So that's also really important. These were not pie in the sky discussions. And I have to say that Kazakhstan, there's always a shopping list, as you know, but they were very specific about needs, affordable housing, energy efficient builds, transitions to new economies, aviation clusters, earth sensing satellites, technology transfer, mining technology, aerospace, legal assistance. They were very specific, and healthcare as well. Because, the largest nuclear polygon is in northern Kazakhstan, It's a legacy of the Soviet Union, not Russia. It was closed by former President Nazarbayev like 3 days after the 91 coup. Well, 1 month. It was September it was closed. The health issue in terms of cancer, goiters in children, the legacy is huge, not only on farms and livestock, but on children and families. Healthcare, heart disease, hospitals, they became a priority. Much easier dealing when the on requests, when the shopping list is concrete. And we were able to bring to the table people who could, experts in Canada who could respond to those requirements.
Well, I can say that your leadership as ambassador was critical, I think, in the formative years of the council. So we'll say thank you to you for taking that on.
Oh, it was a pleasure. But once again, I have to underline that my access to then, he was not president then, to His Excellency Tokayev, His Excellency Nazarbayev, and ministers and the Prime Minister, I cannot believe it. Every time I asked for a meeting, I got it.
Well,
small country like Canada, we did quadruple our trade during my time. We expanded it from grain, it was actually agriculture machinery up north, to grain, to livestock on hoof, to genetics, and then technology on mining.
Well, good for you.
The Caspian Sea is important because it's offshore drilling, and in Atlantic Canada, we have offshore drilling.
Yeah, that's right. I know it's a challenging environment there, but and offshore is completely off limits for Russia right now. But we can still work on the Caspian projects with Kazakhstan. Now, tell me about what happened after you left Central Asia. I know you worked with Canada's nuclear regulator to expand an international nuclear strategy. What was that about? How does Canada fit into the international nuclear strategy?
Canada used to be number one uranium producer in the world. Then there was Kazakhstan and Australia. Subsequently, Kazakhstan became the number one uranium producer, followed by Canada and then Australia. It was certainly the impetus to get a strategy which would lead us ultimately to a nuclear non-proliferation agreement, bilateral between Canada and Kazakhstan, which we did, and that was critical.
So that agreement signed? That was successful?
Oh, yes. The minister at the time was John Baird. So, yes.
Now, you say Kazakhstan overtook Canada as the world's number one uranium producer. That was to a great extent because of Canadian investment in Kazakhstan, was it not?
That's right. We had Cameco, who has been in Kazakhstan and still is for years, with substantial investments, substantial production, and extremely good partnership with Kazakhstan. And as you know, President of Cameco, Tim Gitzel, is the co-chair on the Kazakhstan-Canada Business Council together with Pirmatov, the chairman and CEO of Kazatomprom. So Canada on nuclear has enjoyed very positive discussions.
What a nice story that is. You know, we have bad news in Russia, we have bad news in Kyrgyzstan. From Kazakhstan, it's all been good, at least commercially.
Oh, there have been some issues where companies have been dissolved or were bought by other foreign nationals, where there were legal impediments, where companies would ask me to end up in court for them just to witness how the trial and the witnesses and testimony would roll out. The fact that I was allowed in courts, the fact that companies trusted me when they didn't have a presence on the ground, when it was all new, I think that speaks to both, again, the Kazakh government, the Kyrgyz government, and the people.
There are so many leaders with the name Margaret. We have Margaret Thatcher, Margaret Atwood, Princess Margaret. It seems that you were destined to be a leader. What do you think made you a leader?
I don't know that I'm very much of a leader, but I do believe in teams. And I had the privilege of working through my federal public service for amazing people. And I remember one assistant deputy minister at Fisheries, as he said, come with me to the executive meeting. I don't have time to send you on a management course, but this is important. You will speak to the cleaner, your assistant, the deputy, and the minister in the same tone. You will treat them equally.
Good life advice, it sounds like.
Yeah, that was my management course.
You talk about good teams. I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you on behalf of Chisholm. As you know, I worked with Chisholm in the Russian market for 25 years, and the late great Tim Chisholm was effusive in his praise and support of Margaret Skok. He remembered you fondly, and I think was very grateful for your role in opening up Eurasian markets to Canadian pork, which, as we know, for about 15 years was 20 years was booming business.
Yes, very important, but every opening is important. And Mr. Chisholm, I did have the opportunity of meeting him on Lake Russo in Ontario with my children, and we were delighted to meet him, and he personally thanked me. I think if I can add one thing, it's one of the imperatives for change in Central Asia is that, unlike in Canada or in a lot of Western countries where the majority of people are seniors, and I'm not looking at you, Nathan, right now, I'm thinking about me.
I'm in Russia anyway, I don't count.
Right. But, there's a whole new generation of young adults that has grown up, and the majority, almost 40%, are under 30. So there's an imperative to make sure that there are social and economic opportunities and cooperation.
Yes, we need to provide jobs. We need to make sure that the youth have something to do in our economy. And to be honest, I'm not worried about the youth. I'm more worried about you and me, Margaret. And that leads me to my next question. What does the future hold for Margaret Skok? Just to wrap it up, what are your plans for the future?
As a pensioner, maybe cryogenics, maybe transferring a little bit more information before I quietly disappear into the western sunset.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thank you so much, Margaret, for being with us today. It's been a great discussion. I've been joined today by Margaret Skok, federal public servant who worked with RCMP, Fisheries and Oceans, and Ag Food Canada, was stationed at the Moscow Embassy from 1991 to 94, and was ambassador, plenipotentiary of Canada to the Republic of Kazakhstan, accredited to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan from 2006 to 2009, in spite of the fact that I got those dates wrong during the introduction. But now we've figured that out. Thank you so much for being with us today, Margaret. It's been a great discussion.
Pleasure, and happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays to you too. Bye-bye.
Critical to any of the successes that I've had have been the teams at the embassies, but also at home in Ottawa and the different ministries, plus global affairs. I would be remiss if I had not mentioned, in getting my appointment to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, Senator Peter Harder, who supported me, and the former president and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Michael Binder. Also, the Right Honourable Monsieur Chrétien had continuously supported, with ministers and senators, our bilateral relationship with Kazakhstan and beyond. This is particularly important to note. The premiers and of the provinces and territories, as well as our companies, were critical to any of our successes.
You've been listening to IceBreakers, the podcast produced by CERBA, a nonprofit business association supporting trade, investment, and good relations between Canada and the countries of Eurasia. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can join our LinkedIn group to send questions to guests and find more information about the podcast series in general on our website at www.serbanet.org. Thanks for tuning in.